Well, greetings and welcome, everyone. Hope everyone's doing well. This is going to be a discussion on sections 4 and part of 5 of your notes. This is Unit 4, the American Revolution, and in this particular video, we're going to be looking at how the American Revolution started militarily. In the previous video, sections 1 through 3, we looked at the background to the war. Why did war start? What were the problems that the colonists had with the British and the British had with the colonists? So now we're going to look at the military aspect of that. And it really starts in April of 1775. And I've entitled this particular slide One April Morning. It's a title of a book. It's a title of a video, of a movie. And it's really about the beginning of the American Revolution. So what has happened is that the Continental Congress has met. They've done their thing. And the British are not happy about the First Continental Congress. It was actually a meeting that took place illegally. And so the British decide to go arrest some high-ranking members of the Continental Congress. Among them were Samuel Adams. He's the leader of the Sons of Liberty. John Hancock, an extremely wealthy merchant in Boston, who was also at the Continental Congress. And the British have also heard about weapons being stored in Concord, Massachusetts, where these two men are at. And so the idea is the British are going to go in and arrest these two men and seize these weapons that could be used in a rebellion. So 700 British soldiers leave Boston the night of the 18th, and they are marching about 20 miles or so to Concord. On their way, they have to pass through the village of Lexington. And on Lexington Green, this is the center of town, park in the middle of town, so to speak, they're going to be met by about 70 colonial militiamen. Now, a militiaman is someone who is a civilian, a citizen, who has a little bit of military training. And the idea is they are kind of like the National Guard, so to speak. Their job is to protect the village from like Native American Indian attacks and things of that nature. These guys are called Minutemen because they are to be ready to fight at a moment's or a minute's notice. And ultimately, they're ordered to leave by the British, and a shot is fired. We don't know who fired that first shot. We don't know if it was an accident. We don't know if it was purposeful. We don't know if it was British or colonial. We don't know. But what we do know is that a shot is fired, and when you have two armed groups facing each other in a conflict and a very tense situation and a shot's fired, what do you think is going to be the outcome? That's right. They're both going to start firing at each other, and that's what happened. Ultimately, there are 8 colonial deaths, 1 British soldier is wounded, and the Minutemen run off. 70 against 700 does not add up, does it? The British continue on to Concord. They get there, and guess what? There's no Samuel Adams. There's no John Hancock. The weapons are not there either. There is a skirmish at the North Bridge, the bridge on the north end of town of Concord, and the British turn around and have to march back to Boston. Along the way, Minutemen from all over Massachusetts who've heard these shots and heard the news are lining up on the road, hiding behind trees, and taking shots at the British soldiers as they march back to Boston. Over 100 soldiers are going to be killed. More than 170 will be wounded. And ultimately, the events at Lexington and Concord is the beginning of the American Revolution. So that's its really big significance. The American Revolution has begun. The fight has begun. So here's my my historical art for this particular event. And there's a couple of things here, first of all, notice these are clearly soldiers here in the background. These are British regular soldiers, red uniforms, straight lines, great discipline, and they are fighting the colonials. Now ask yourself, do these men here look like soldiers? And I think the answer should be no. First of all, there's very little discipline. Second, there is no uniform. And so it's going to be interesting to see as time goes on how this group of civilians, non-soldiers, becomes soldiers. How these Minutemen, these militia, are formed into an army that can take this on. And so that's what this war is going to show, ultimately, in many cases. So big difference here. And there is a video attached to my Google Slides. It's called April Morning, again. And it's a reenactment, obviously. It's a movie made back in the 90s, and the acting is horrifically bad. But it gives you a sense of idea of how these guys would have fought on Lexington Green. We're not going to watch it. We're just going to advance on and look at the first real major battle of the war. And that takes place in around Boston. Now remember, Boston has been the hotbed of all these issues. This is where the Boston Massacre took place. This is where the Boston Tea Party has taken place. The British soldiers who marched on Lexington and Concord have marched out of Boston. And so once those soldiers are back in Boston after their disastrous march to Concord, the American militia surrounds Boston and lays siege to it. Now, what that officially means is a siege is an action where an army surrounds a town and you don't let anyone in or out. And the idea is to starve that town into submission. Now, the problem with Boston is it's a port city. And so the British always have a way of getting out by water. And ultimately, what we have is we have the town of Boston. Let's say it's right here. Outside of Boston is a series of hills. Okay? And this is Bunker Hill, right outside of town. And if you could put cannon up on the high ground, you can shell the city very easily. And so whoever controls the high ground has a major advantage. And at the moment, the Americans are on the high ground. The British want the high ground to prevent the Americans from attacking them in the city. And so the British have to march up the hill to kick the American colonists off. And the British are actually going to make 3 attacks. The first 2 are disastrous. They get shot to pieces. They have to retreat down out of range, reform, and attack again. Only on the 3rd attack, when the Americans are running out of gunpowder and ammunition, do the British succeed. But it is a very costly victory for the British. In fact, there's more than 1,000 dead and wounded British soldiers here. The American losses are much, much lighter. And so the Americans, even though they got forced out of their position and had to leave, they really still considered this a victory because they showed that they could stand up and fight this mighty British army. And so Bunker Hill really becomes a symbol of how America can stand up to the British if they're properly supplied. And that's going to be a big issue throughout the war. So here's the art for that event. And I like this piece simply for a couple of reasons. First of all, it shows that perfectly straight line those British soldiers are being forced to march in. And you can tell this is the 3rd of 3 attacks. How do we know that? Well, first of all, a couple of these guys are bandaged up, missing their hats and what have you. So they've already seen some action and they've reformed. Secondly, we have some British soldiers lying here in the field. And in fact, these 2 lines are the remnants of the first 2 attacks. This shows how far they got on their first and second attempts. And so it just kind of shows that how difficult it's going to be for these men to march up a hill into the face of colonial fire, who are, these colonists are behind wagons and crates and barrels and things like that for protection. So they've got a much better position here at Bunker Hill. All of this has happened before the Second Continental Congress has met. And the Continental Congress goes ahead and meets, and all 13 colonies are now present. Even Georgia shows up for this one. Now, if you remember the First Continental Congress, they sent a list of demands to Parliament and said, we're going to get back together in a year if nothing has changed. Well, obviously, things have become worse. And so now the colonies are back in Philadelphia. They are looking for a restoration of their rights. We are still not talking about independence yet. Now, that's a very big key here. At this point, we're still not talking about independence. What we are saying is we are going to fight for our rights. We're not just going to send a piece of paper anymore, although they did send a petition to the king again, saying, hey, we just want nothing but peace. But they're also saying if we don't get it, we're going to fight for our rights. We're still not after independence. They're still not talking that away yet. That's 6 months away. But what they are saying is we want our rights. And that's going to be a really big key. Another big piece that comes out of the Second Continental Army is they say, okay, all the militia around Boston, they are now our army. So we now have an actual army, and we are going to adopt that army around Boston. And that's great. But here's the thing. If you have an army, you have to have a commander. And who are we going to get to command the Continental Army? That's right, our old friend, George Washington. He is going to be selected to lead the Continental Army. He's going to be its only commander throughout the entire war. And he has a monumental challenge ahead. How does he turn this band of militiamen, of citizens who want to be soldiers, into soldiers? So he has to come up with a plan to do all this. He has to figure out a way. He never has more than 10,000 men at any given time. And he's fighting an army that is twice or 3 times his size in some cases. So he has to find a way to preserve his men as much as possible, yet teach them how to become a well-functioning army. So monumental task George Washington has. A little bit more about Washington very quickly. If you remember, he started the French and Indian War when he was 21 years old. He is a Virginian, and this was on purpose. So far, most of the action has happened up around Boston and in Massachusetts. By selecting a Virginian as the man in charge of the army, the Continental Congress is showing the unity that the colonists have. He is also incredibly wealthy. He's one of the wealthiest men, not only in Virginia, but in all of the colonies, actually. He is also going to take command of those in Boston, and he's going to become very, very inspiring to the men. People want to please Washington. He inspires people to perform at their best. And so Washington is going to be a major asset. I've already talked about how he has to build an army and hold it together in the face of all the problems he's going to encounter. And one of the biggest things he's going to encounter is simply there's not enough supplies for his soldiers. Washington is actually going to use some of his own money and supply his men, whether it's with clothing or weapons or gunpowder or food. Washington believes enough in the cause and in his soldiers to prepare them himself if that money is not forthcoming from the Congress. He is also going to have an extensive spy network. And a lot has been made about this in the last several years about his spy network. And this is really very important because he has inside knowledge about what the British are planning. And that is going to allow him to kind of be one step ahead. And so that's going to be pretty important. Now, on the opposite side, we're not going to talk about the British commander, but we are going to talk about a British guy. But I want to make one last point about Washington here. He is the enduring symbol of the American Revolution. The lasting symbol of the Revolution is George Washington. Most of the time when people think of the American Revolution, they think of George Washington, even to this day here in the 21st century. So people still think of Washington as the embodiment of the revolution. And that's kind of a big deal. So King George III, this is King George III. He is the King of England. He controls the colonies. But that's the issue. He controls the colonies. So far, people in the colonies have been protesting what's going on. All those taxes, the Boston Massacre, everything has been aimed at Parliament. And they've said George is not a bad guy, but here's the issue. King George III really had little sympathy for the colonies. He refuses to read the messages the Continental Congress are sending him. And after the events at Bunker Hill, George III basically tells Parliament, I'm not protecting the colonies. You do with them whatever you need to. So this is basically a declaration of war by the King of England on the American colonies. And he says they're in rebellion. You have to stop this. And so Parliament is going to push forward with a war. Now, George III has a lot of ties to Germany. And he is actually going to hire German troops, foreign mercenaries, to help fight his war against the British, or against the American colonists, excuse me. A mercenary is someone who fights for pay, not for their ideas or beliefs. You're usually a foreigner coming in someplace else and fighting for pay from them. And so in this case, we have British Hessians who are taking British money. We have German Hessians taking British money to fight the American colonists. About 30,000 of these Hessians are going to come to America. Now, a Hessian is someone who is from the German states of Hesse-Kassel. And they are considered some of the very best soldiers in Europe. They are highly trained. They are intimidating. They are known for their ruthlessness. So George has gone out and recruited these super soldiers of the time and brought them to the colonies to fight the American colonists. And this really terrifies the colonists. A lot of guys are horrified by this. A lot of guys are very angry by this. And they really feel that George III has totally betrayed them by hiring these German Hessians. A little bit more about the Hessians. As I said, they are from Germany. They are considered somewhat of the most professional soldiers in the world at the time. These Germans typically were 6 foot tall. You had to be of a certain height to be allowed into these elite units. They wore this funky little hat called a mitre, which gave them an extra foot of height. They wore long flowing mustaches, all of them. You can see the mustaches on these guys. They also have long braids going down their backs. They all considered the long braid a symbol of victory. Once, if they were defeated, they would cut their braid. So a lot of these guys have braids going down to about their waist. So these guys are terrifyingly professional, and it's going to really upset the American colonists. And again, these Germans are from Hesse-Kassel, Hesse-Hanau. These are German pieces of what will become Germany a little bit later. And they are mercenaries who are terrifying to the American colonists. So with that, we are kind of going to stop right there. That's kind of the end of section 4. And now we're going to go on and look at some documents that led to the revolution. But we're going to do that in the next video. So stay tuned for that, and hope everyone has a great day.